Good morning and welcome to Known and Trusted. My name is Anna Sonoda, licensed clinical social worker, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Barbara, a fellow social worker. Barbara has a long history in medical social work, hospice social work, and she and I overlapped in treatment of sexual offenders for a time. So welcome, Barbara. Thank you for being on Known and Trusted. I brought you here today to have an open dialogue. You and I have been friends for many decades now, and I believe you have a really interesting lived experience when it comes to being a mom and in going through the divorcing process and co-parenting. I've told you in previous conversations that you stand out as someone who's done divorce extremely well. And I wonder if we can have a little open discussion today for our listeners to explore some of those themes and ways in which you and your co-parent have facilitated the growth and development of your daughters in such a fantastic way, and to cover some of the issues and landmines that come up that people may be going through right now or that they may be embarking on in the future if they're preparing for a divorce or separation.
As hard as it is, the number one priority is keeping the kids front and center. If you start with that goal, then everything can flow from there. And it can be very difficult when things get really tense.
What do you think is the greatest way to keep that focus when
I think that focusing on the good traits of my ex and never ever letting my personal feelings about anything that was going on interfere with my desire to form and strengthen a great bond between my girls and their dad. And starting from that, and the fact that my ex-husband and I like each other, even though we can drive each other crazy sometimes, we still like each other. And we started our relationship on that foundation. And starting there, we kind of went back to that as our marriage was not working out. And we focused on our friendship and shared values. That is the thing. There were so many things that we shared in terms of our goals.
and I love how you said that you had such a strong bedrock.
We had started having some discussions, but didn't want to make any changes until both of our kids were in school. So it was even before then. My kids are 18 months apart. And so we were waiting until our younger daughter got into kindergarten. And so there was some structure there. I wasn't having to worry about what was going on and taking care of my younger child at home. She was in school and we were focused on that. And that did help. So they were like 5 and 6 and a half.
And divorce can really expand a child's world seemingly overnight. New adults, new routines, new environments. Where, when you were assessing those components, how did you assess risk?
First of all, when I was getting out of school, when you and I were in our master's program for social work together, um, I focused on getting out of school and getting a job that was flexible so that I could be available to make sure my kids were protected, supported, felt safe, felt like we were both there for them. So the fact that we got along well allowed us to arrange for joint custody, which my ex wanted as well. And he was very devoted to that. I knew he would be a devoted dad. So we got that squared away and we split every week in half. We lived literally a couple houses down from each other so that the kids would be close by and we could have good communication and keep them in the same neighborhood where we felt really good. They felt safe.
That's a really incredible decision, that alone, just from a global perspective, what that does to a child. I know there's a growing movement now of parents leaving the house and children remaining in the house, but the next best thing is what you and your ex did.
There was no worry for me. Actually, I don't even know why this came about, but there was a house for lease on my street. And I just, even before any of my neighbors knew it, I leased that house and with discussing it with my ex. And so we could present that to the kids when we told them that we were going to divorce. And they knew all the neighbors. We all were a little village and helped each other. If there was an emergency, we could take each other's kids in. And these were like my family. I knew these folks like my family, and my kids consider them, and we still consider them today, our family. So that was really, really helpful. It truly felt that way. And even after the first couple of years, when I was ready to move out of that house, I got, with the help of my ex, I got a condo around the corner so that we were always very close in physical proximity to each other. And it made it easy to go back and forth.
Why does that why does that matter so much in divorce? That proximity piece. Why does that matter, do you think?
Being with each parent, it made us flex a little bit. And it was easier to flex. If something was happening that was unexpected, some kind of meeting or family emergency or whatever, it made it much easier to have the kids be with one or the other or go back and forth. It just made it simpler. That's all. That's the only thing I can think of, really. But plus, the neighborhood was instrumental in keeping me sane during the process and going back to work and getting adjusted to being a working single parent. It just made one of the factors that make it difficult for some people out of the mix.
And I love how you said that sometimes being flexible with your ex is really the linchpin of keeping communication going and not building resentment. So, because you had close proximity, it was easy to maybe shift gears and pick the girls up on a day you weren't planning to, or for him to step in during times that you weren't necessarily planning on it. And having that level of communication showed how mature you and your ex were, because I often hear horror stories from individuals who are fighting, not only fighting with their ex, but fighting in front of the children. What tips or recommendations would you have for moms or dads who are going through the divorcing process?
The more you communicate with each other, then there aren't misunderstandings, misconnections with who's doing what. We communicated through, mostly at that time, phone conversations. We weren't texting like we do today. So there were emails when we needed to send detailed information, phone calls if something was a quick whatever. And sometimes we had to have long conversations to go over things in more depth to coordinate everything. So I would say, keeping each other informed about things at school, we have to talk about things where the kids are having some kind of challenge or issue that needs both parents. And the big thing that I think needs to be said, we've had a lot of people say, "Oh, you all should write a book about how to do this." And I've always just responded and said, I don't know that you can learn this. Maybe you can learn, maybe you can, but boy, you have to be dedicated. And I think the fact that my ex and I liked each other helped a lot. And we didn't do anything terrible to each other. I think a lot of people have a lot of trouble because one does something that is unforgivable to the other, and then the other has a hard time letting go of it or moving beyond it or keeping the focus on the children. So, since we got along pretty well, it was a lot easier for us to have conversations than I think a lot of people, I think they forget the damage they might be doing to their kids by not communicating and not showing respect for their former spouse.
Yeah, I think that's really important and worth addressing directly, that the way you communicate to your ex is a direct influence on the children who are in your care or in your ex spouse's care. That children are picking up on conversations, they're picking up on tone. We sometimes ignore or play down how much we think children can pick up in an environment between adults or between a conversation. And obviously, outright fighting and arguing is detrimental and harmful. We know that more and more with research. But I think those little undercuts and little side insults or passive aggressive moves.
My kids are now 26 and 27, almost 28, that they the way they processed it, they now think it's really funny that we were married, and they know our flaws and our the ways we're different, and they find it funny, and they joke now like, "Oh, I can't believe you guys were ever married." But then we joke and tease about the foibles of the other parent, and it's in a loving and caring way and not in a real critical way. But the tone really is important, and I'm not saying they never heard us argue or disagree, but nobody ever did anything really destructive. Nobody said your dad's a terrible person, your mom's the B word or something worse. And we just never had that. But I think we really trusted each other. I think thinking about going to your known and trusted theme on your podcast, it's hard when you can't trust your spouse. And I've seen some terrible situations where people were hiding money from the other spouse or something worse. I've heard some very difficult situations. One friend I just heard over the weekend, the way she found out, she and her spouse had four boys, and the way she found out there was a problem was the FBI knocked on her front door with a warrant for her husband's arrest for child porn. And yeah, and there was no way to keep all that from her children. I mean, they were older. I don't know how old they were, but older. And I don't think any of them has much of a relationship with their dad at this point. Anyway, luckily, I never had to worry about that. I mean, if I called Lee and said, this is coming up, I need money for something unexpected, he would just send it to me or give it to me. And we would agree and move on from there. But he never worried about whether he could believe what I was saying about some need or something, and vice versa. And that foundation made everything possible. If I couldn't have trusted him and he couldn't have trusted me, we would never have made it with this. So
I love the way you said that because you do think about the stories that get a lot of attention and that remarkable case that you heard about recently with the FBI, that this can go so badly so quickly. And so when you have experiences like your story of divorce that is not only amicable, but ways in which you can intentionally override any attempts or efforts to undermine the other person for the best interest of the children, really tipping that focus from me and what I have endured through this relationship instead into it's all about these kids. Can you speak a little bit about, because I think when we hear about divorce, we think that person is now out of my life. I've divorced them. I have a clean slate. I'm moving on. Uniquely, when you have a child with someone, you are forever tethered to that other individual. Can you speak a little bit about what, maybe for people who are contemplating divorce, who are in a difficult phase in their relationship or in their marriage, or going through a separation, can you speak a little bit to maybe our impression of divorce as a cut?
if it's working right, you're forever bound to that other person.
Because birthday parties, weddings, graduations, you have all that stuff. And then when there are problems or medical things or ER visits, you have like another limb
You are never
of the
free and
system.
you're never free and clear. You really aren't. And I'm glad about that. Because I was lucky enough to get along well enough to have joint custody. The kids were with me 4 nights a week and Lee 3 nights a week, but they were with him on the weekend. And I did all the school, picking up and dropping off most of the time, although he did it on his days too. You are bound with them forever, and you better get along because even though as they're grown up, they don't, it's not, yeah, they're done. They're out of my house, they're out of Lee's house. We spend our time with them, but they're not, we're more like friends than parents in a lot of ways now to them, now that they're grown up. There is always something. We're lucky enough that we can go on a vacation together and still have our family unit, my brother and his wife and their son, and Lee and me and our girls. We go on a vacation together every year. And when I remarried, that became less possible. I had a few years in there where I didn't. But then once my husband died, we have reverted completely back to that pattern. And it also helps because we spend some lengthy time with one another and can have, it sort of helps us maintain the bond, I think. And I think he would talk more on the phone and stay better in touch than I would if it was up to both of us. But having the joint, back to the joint custody, that gave me the breaks that I needed from full time parenting to help me be more refreshed. Now, I was always available, and there were always times that we had to override that. But it did give me sort of that separation that I needed to have a break, which I think a lot of people don't have, and that makes it harder for them. They only get every other, moms often only still get every other weekend off and maybe Wednesday night dinners. I think that's still pretty prevalent. But I did have more breaks than most people, and it really did help.
And I believe it ties in very nicely with this idea of proximity. You didn't move a state away. You didn't move to, a destination that was removed from the community that the girls had been rooted in already, and that allowed for a little bit more flexibility.
Totally. And that made me, as you were talking, I was thinking about the dating aspect of
Oftentimes,
things
the
and
one to
how that can
struggle and suffer the
interfere.
most is
And
not
I
the
met
ex, it's
Ed
the
about
children.
5 years after my divorce from Lee. And I had been out on some dates and things before, but I made a personal decision. I'm not introducing anyone to my children or involving them in any of that unless and until it's more serious. So keeping that tension and trouble out of it, which I think can create a lot of tension between people who remarry quickly, is what I'm trying to say, or they're moving in someone new into their home with their children. We made decisions. We weren't doing any of that, and didn't need to, didn't have to, and chose not to make sure that the kids never felt like they had to adapt to a whole new family situation when they're just trying to deal with what they've got from losing the old family situation. And then if you have stepchildren and all that, it really can get super complicated.
Yes. How did you manage your own desire for dating time and relationship time, covering those days that you didn't have the girls?
Great question. I think again the joint custody situation helped a lot because I did make the decision to only date or any of that on days when the kids were not with me. And then eventually, after I met Ed, his kids were a little older, but we discovered that he had his kids for Wednesday night dinners. And so we discovered we liked the same local restaurant. And so we started going to the restaurant. We started going to that restaurant on Wednesday nights, and he would bring his kids, and we didn't sit together initially, but we kind of slowly introduced everybody to each other. And then eventually we started having those dinners together on Wednesday nights. So that was the only way I kind of combined until much later on. The only way I combined my family with Ed's family. And but otherwise we just got together when they weren't with us. And at that time he still had every other weekend. So we didn't get together on the weekends he had his kids with him because he was doing the same thing. He was involved with what they were doing, and I didn't need to be involved in that. I love his kids, but I didn't need to be involved in that and vice versa. So slowly we got more involved with one another, but Ed and I did not live together until we got married. So, and my kids were One was still in high school, the other was in college or going to college. And so it wasn't such an issue at that time. But yeah, we did keep it separate. That person, his daughter was grown. And so that was easy with that. He viewed my being a parent as a positive, and that made everything so much easier. I didn't have a situation where my kids were meeting different people I was dating at all. I dated this one person. Then I went out on a few individual dates that didn't turn into anything. And then I finally met Ed. And he liked the fact that I was a parent. He didn't think that a woman who is not a parent would be a good fit for him. And that was very fortunate. So, but neither one of us was interested in pushing anything forward. It just kind of happened organically with the Wednesday night dinner. So I think a lot of people have to deal with that a lot more because
Mm.
you might date a number of people before you meet the right person. And I don't know what you do in that situation. But one thing I knew is I don't do anything the traditional way. I I really, I had a lot of fears about that. And my therapist at the time was like, I don't know why you were so worried about this because you don't do things the way other people do. You weren't going to have the same fraught problems because of the way you go about things. And I guess I have to say that must be true because I have met a few people that have done it like I have, but not many, and other complicating factors, but not many.
You and I had a similar experience of working in a treatment center for convicted sex offenders. And I think one of the takeaways that I took from that experience was that women raising children in a home without present male partner are at higher risk for predation. And I think one thing that we sometimes struggle with as a culture is addressing that head on, whether acknowledging it or allowing for there to be room for two truths to exist, that everybody wants partnership or that many people are seeking partnership and that it's not a death sentence when you have children, but that you need to be conscientious and aware of.
Boy, yeah, so true because as you know way better than I do, a lot of step parents are the problem out there. And so, or just anybody that has access to your kids, like if you're dating someone, even if they're not a step parent. And I just avoided that by just making a decision to stay away from trying to create any kind of blended family before my kids were grown up. And the supports that I used to help me were known and trusted people. At our church, we had a drop-in daycare kind of situation that I used, and I knew the people that worked there, the women that worked there. When my kids were a little older and I used my network. That's one thing that was really good to help find trusted people. One of my close friends is a Georgia Tech alumna, and she got connected with one of the sororities there, and these wonderful girls from this sorority, they all were connected. And whenever we needed a new person, one girl would graduate, and then she connect us with some of her sorority sisters. That these girls were just amazing, and I let them, as I grew to trust with them, they would pick up my kids after school and do their homework with them. And they loved them. The kids loved them so much. And they were so sad when one would graduate and then they'd have to get to know somebody new. These girls were all interwoven with one another. So I had a good network through that to create a trusted environment. But luckily I just kind of decided I'm not bringing anybody home to my kids until it's somebody I'm going to be with permanently. I really just, no, not going to do it.
And I'm so curious how, when you found Ed and you fell in love and you knew it was a sure thing and that you wanted to get married again, How did you manage sharing a home with, you had one daughter living with you at the time and one in college, but you know how college is. They're always sort of popping back and forth and staying summers and things. How did you manage from a logistical perspective?
Well, and this is another complicating factor, and that is that I married Ed once I knew he had a terminal diagnosis. He had brain cancer, and we dated all those years with the joint custody and all that, keeping that separate, except my kid, they knew each other then, and but I still kept the any kind of overnight stays or anything like that separate. And then Ed got this terminal diagnosis, and that's when we got married and he moved in. And so it was a totally different situation at that point. And my kids, luckily, they each had a car. Their dad had gotten them not new cars, but cars. So they could go back and forth easily. They came and went. They each had bedrooms, their own bedrooms at each home, so they could go in their room, shut the door, shut it out, and choose their level of involvement. And they were busy going out and doing things with their friends and all that. So it was different than combining families with two healthy parents who are going about their daily life, because Ed immediately stopped working and pretty soon he was in a wheelchair, and we had a caregiver in the home who was an amazing guy that I got through a referral from somebody else, and grew to trust him. He had keys to my house and was just amazing. And now, ironically, he's up helping my in-laws in where they live in Massachusetts.
Barbara, I'm so grateful to hear about your experience and what a remarkable decision that was to get married to Ed, knowing that his beautiful life would be shortened. And what I'm also wondering about the impact on your ex, as well as the impact on your girls going through that process. Is there anything that stood out to you as you look back on that experience?
It makes me realize I probably need to talk to them about what they thought about it, because at the time, we were all just putting one foot in front of the other. Lee and Ed knew each other and liked each other. They didn't spend a lot of time together, but they were fine. They chatted one on one more than once, and Lee felt that this was one thing that was really important. Lee felt comfortable with Ed. He observed the way he was with his kids. He was a devoted dad. So I think he felt comfortable with Ed very quickly. Once you've got an ill person in your household, everything changes. And I'd like to know, I really should talk to them about what they, in retrospect, think about going through that experience. Because they were still going back and forth, until I need to put the timeline together exactly, but Ed went to Caroline's graduation in his wheelchair, but having an in-person, and my kids were very familiar with terminal illness. They had heard me on the phone with many patients, and just, they learned a lot, I think, about it just from being in my household. So they kind of took it in stride better than I think most kids would. And luckily they were older by the time it happened.
And you have a remarkable background in medical social work and hospice social work. For people who may not be familiar with hospice social work, can you explain what a hospice social worker's role is and how you
Mhm.
assisted families while you were doing that work?
Sure. So Medicare requires that every hospice patient has a social worker. In fact, Medicare requires an interdisciplinary team, which consists of a doctor, a nurse, a chaplain, and a social worker. And the nurse primarily manages the care in conjunction with the social worker. So the social worker's job is to initially assess the issues that are facing the family. And that includes all kinds of things beyond that facing having a loved one with a terminal illness. But you have to figure out all the other things they need. Like, do they need a lawyer to help them create a will? Do they need planning for their kids? Do they have a child that needs guardianship? Do they need to arrange for that child to live with the other parent, or who are they going to live with when this parent passes away? Or do they have an intact family that the other parent is just going to continue on? And just a lot of technical things, helping people with financial difficulties, connecting them with community resources that they may need. And illnesses, as we all know, place a lot of strain on a family emotionally and financially. So that's what the social worker does. And also just provides a lot of listening and a lot of explaining what's going on. You have to have a lot of medical knowledge, and you help them understand what's coming, what's happening, all the way to the point where the person passes away. And afterwards, sometimes we would call the funeral home. We would explain what that process entails. So it's a lot, but those are the basics of it.
Yeah, it's so strange to me how disconnected we are as a culture from death. So, someone like yourself, when people are embarking on a long-term illness or a sudden diagnosis, they're almost thrust into a new world where they didn't realize there's a pattern. Just like I talk about the pattern of grooming, you
Mhm,
experience and educate people about the pattern of death. What are the predictable steps that are going to occur as someone
mhm,
prepares for the dying process? And
mhm.
many people, for many people, it will be the first time that they're even given that type of insight or education.
True, very true. Then you've got everything from one end of the spectrum to the other. People who um one of this is since it's you doing this, one some really, whatever the family dynamics are, they're all amplified in this situation. If they're good, the family draws together, even though there can be additional tensions. But if they're not good, it makes it worse. And so you really have to figure out what the family needs. And so you've got some people who are still saying a miracle is going to occur and I'm going to be cured, to people who want to blame their doctors for what is happening, to blaming the person themselves for not taking good care of themselves or whatever they did. And then you've got everything to other people who are going to have some relief when the person passes away. Maybe they've been taking care of a dementia loved one with dementia for 10 or 15 years. But then they don't realize they're going to face a huge loss when that person passes away, not only of the person, but the role of being a caregiver. And then they're going to be like, what do I do now? There's so many things that come into play. One of the more interesting ones I had was a man whose adult kids came from out of town, and they really they were very limited in what they wanted to do and how they were approaching it, and they took us outside the hospital room with away from the patient, and they said, look, we just need to tell you our dad abused us our whole lives, and we are here because we are human, and he deserves to have care, but there's a limit to what we are willing to do given everything. So you've got so many complex situations that you're trying to help people navigate. It's you got if you can't understand other people and get into what their dynamic is, because it's not about you, it's about them, and you've got to be able to understand it. You can't help them, so you better be able to figure it out and try to do your best to get into their world and figure out what they need. It's not unlike
Yeah,
raising kids.
see, I was just thinking what a similarity between how we
Mhm.
started this conversation about no matter what's happening in the marriage or the divorce, the focus is how do we raise these kids and launch them effectively and put our own needs or conflicts aside so that we stay focused. And similarly in death and preparation for the dying, it's about what does that patient need and
So
managing the
true.
expectations.
That's like a brand new insight. I hadn't really thought about it that way before, but there are some serious similarities there. And maybe we could extend that to friendships and other family relationships, each one, requires something different.
Would you speak a bit about the impact of Ed's passing on your ex and the children since they had formed a relationship with him through your courtship with him and your marriage?
The kids were a lot more upset than I thought they would be. Um, they were so sweet at our memorial service and were so tearful, and um, they told me we love Ed, and so it was really amazing. I mean, they did really well, I think. And I think some of that is because, they've seen me help so many people through it. But I wonder how that impacts them today, looking, when they're looking back on it. I wonder what is the impact. Makes me realize I have some conversations I need to have with them about it.
Well, Ed was a remarkable man. I've had the pleasure of meeting both Lee and Ed, and you have a very good picker, Barbara. You're good at assessing character, and these are two really outstanding men. And I think when relationship or if relationships end, I think I talked about this recently in another episode, this idea that we're teaching kids that in relationship, there are breaks and there are opportunities to rebuild and reconnect and break and rebuild, that is not something that is outside of the norm of relationship. And our responsibility and our obligation in healthy, loving, trustworthy relationships is to practice that and then to model that for our children.
So true. Coming from, my parents got divorced when I was a freshman in college, and after many years of not a good relationship. But and this is a whole other issue, but part of the reason that my mother couldn't pursue a divorce is because there was no law that until then in the 70s that allowed a woman to get her a credit card in her own name. So women were really stuck a lot of times. It was really difficult, even though my mom was an incredibly intelligent person. But given all that, I did not want my kids to grow up in a household with a bad relationship. Lee and I had a better relationship divorced and than a lot of people we knew that were still married, and wondered about the impact that that was having on their kids, because you learn how to have a relationship from your parents whether you know it or not. And I did not want to repeat that with my kids. I really was hopeful to minimize that damage and hopefully model a situation where I was picking somebody that was a good partner for me.
To that end, what do you think parents tend to worry about that matters less than they think in the divorce process?
It's a good point. Good question. I have to think about it. Wow, it's a really great question.
Stumped you.
You kind of did. You're so good at asking questions, Anna, and your assessment ability is amazing, I think. I think money matters less. That was the first thing that I thought of. I think it can matter a lot at certain times because sometimes one parent walks away with a lot of money and the other one doesn't have much of anything, and that inequity can really impact kids, even though I think they're supposed to mitigate that. They're supposed to help give the lower earning parent enough financial resources so that the households are kind of even. But often that doesn't happen. But I think the relationship between the co-parents matters way more than anything else. I think that is the most important thing. Money matters less as long as the kids have what they need, the basics. And I think schools are the most important thing, really, other than the relationship between the parents. You got to make sure they're in the right school, whatever that means.
And a theme in between you and your ex is that keeping consistency. I think a lot of the lowercase t trauma or the uppercase T trauma can come from switching environments, changing, feeling uprooted. And a pivotal decision that you both made for the best interest of your girls was keeping their community consistent. And that often makes a really remarkable difference when the neighbors are similar, the school is the same, the friends are the same. It can be very debilitating to a child to be in split between two different states or remarkably different communities.
I definitely think that's true. And one of the ways that we worked that out was when we weren't happy with the school situation. Lee and I talked about it. We agreed. Neither one of us was happy with the high school. And so Ed's kids had gone to a different high school that he thought was really good. And he was very focused on education. And so Lee and I agreed that I would move to a better school district with the high school that we wanted our kids to go to. He was going to help me out financially a little more than he had been, but he didn't want to move. He didn't want to go through all that. Plus, the benefit of that was keeping half of their week in their same house that they had grown up in, their same neighborhood, their same street. So they knew they were always a part of that neighborhood. And I hated switching their schools. And I did it mid-year because I didn't want them to be in the other school any longer than they had to. And it was hard for them, but they both told me later on that they thought that was the right decision, that moving to the other school was the right thing. They appreciated it. They were glad they graduated from where they graduated from, and it kept them connected to their neighborhood yet in the better school situation.
I really value what you're saying there because I think oftentimes parents are thinking about lots of tangential issues that may arise during divorce. And one thing that you have kept consistent in our dialogue today is that sense of the rudder is always what do the children need? What's in their best interest? As we prepare to close today, a last question I would have for you is if a parent is listening, feeling overwhelmed, they might be thinking about preparing for a divorce or separation. They may be in the throes of a divorce or separation. What's one place they can begin to regroup or to feel tethered or to feel some stability? One place to begin.
Well, the first thing that occurs to me, and I don't think I can overemphasize the value of this, if you can possibly do it, is get individual therapy because you need a place where you can process these issues. I mean, ideally, if each parent is willing to do it, Lee didn't do it. We had some counseling as a couple before we decided to divorce, but um, I think continuing for me to go and get strong, objective input and guidance and somebody who's asking me the right questions and helping me see through some of the fraught issues, like sometimes the anger and frustration can get to be great. I mean, there's a reason you're getting a divorce, but um but I think the therapy really helped keep me grounded. It helped me keep focusing on the kids because I was dealing with my own feelings and my own issues. And so, if there's any way you can do it, luckily, there are more ways to do it now. I think organizations like BetterHelp, there's community counseling that you can get. There's if you're lucky enough to have insurance, your insurance plan. And a lot of people can't do this anyway. And that's the thing. I mean, there's such a difference. You and I are educated white females who are lucky enough to have some financial means, and we were able to be home with our kids and oversee them in ways a lot of people don't. So, of course, I'm big on advocating for better services, better childcare, better, support services for all parents, whether they're married or divorced. But I think getting my own therapy, even if you can just do a group, do that. That helped keep me together so I could be a good parent.
Barbara, I know that I speak for all of our listeners today when I extend my gratitude for your time and your wisdom and your transparency about something that we often don't talk enough about, which is how to make sure that we're still staying focused on the right things during the divorce and separation process, which is our little kiddos who can fall into vulnerabilities that we may not be aware of if we're taking our eye off the ball. So thank you for your time today to speak to us. And giving us this insight and this wisdom.
You're the best, Anna. Thank you for having the interest to do it and ask the questions.